Richard Kostka is the Eric Weinman Librarian at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you, Nigel.
This institute, this library, doesn't come from coffee. It comes from another dark brown substance. Because I think of Folger, everyone thinks of coffee, and there is no connection.
No, well, there's the Folgers were uncles. The San Francisco Folgers were uncles, but had nothing to do with this library or the fortune that Mr. and Mrs. Folger assembled.
There is a connection with the coffee?
I think it's an uncle that started the coffee industry.
Okay. And what was his first name here?
Henry Clay Folger.
Henry Clay Folger was the president of a big oil company.
He was the chairman of the board of Standard Oil of New York. It's a bit of a rags to riches story. He went to Amherst College, and as an undergraduate, he couldn't pay his tuition his senior year. His roommate's father actually paid his tuition his senior year. And he graduated from Amherst College, thought he was going to be a lawyer, but that didn't quite work out. He ended up at a very menial position with Standard Oil, rose through the ranks, and became chairman of the board of Standard Oil of New York in the Rockefeller year. The Folgers didn't have the wealth of Morgan or Huntington or Newberry or some of the other great industrialists, Ford or DuPont.
There wasn't family wealth.
No,
it was again, as you say, sort of a wonderful American.
That's right. It was
example.
a sort of self-made man, and it wasn't a case of they didn't live lavishly. They didn't tour the continent. They didn't have a home in the Hudson Islands. They didn't have big estates. They lived actually very modestly. They had a home in Brooklyn, and then they later had a home on Long Island, which were nice, but modest in comparison to some of the mansions that some of the other industrialists and big families had. And the interesting thing about Mr. and Mrs. Folger is that they really spent their entire life devoted to this collection, amassing a priceless and peerless collection of Shakespeare and Shakespeareana.
So they had this love of Shakespeare from an early age then, or?
Yes, I mean the story is kind of interesting because when Mr. Folger was an undergraduate, this was the time when sort of the great men tours were taking place in this country. Twain, Emerson, even Oscar Wilde, made the rounds, American cities and small towns, and Dickens. As an undergraduate, Mr. Folger heard Ralph Waldo Emerson speak on campus at Amherst College, and we actually have the ticket. He paid 25 cents to hear that lecture. And there was something about Emerson that young Folger, thought interesting, and he started reading Emerson's essays, particularly Emerson's essay on the nature of poetic genius, an essay in which Shakespeare is a central figure. And that began Mr. Folger's fascination, I think, with the bard and all things Shakespearean. It's interesting because in our reading room, which you've had the pleasure of walking through, you may have noticed that over the fireplace there's an inscription, there's a quote over the fireplace. And a lot of people who were in the reading room see that quote and think, what's Emerson doing in building a monument to Shakespeare? Well, in fact, I think Mr. Folger recognized that debt, recognized that spark, that inspiration, that Emerson caused, and he chose a quote from Emerson to put over the fireplace in the old reading room. So I like the story because, for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a demonstration of something that's still true today, and how important the college years are for individuals, particularly the undergraduate years, and how they can be affected by words, by exposure.
But by exposure to a genius who was, I assume, a great orator as well.
Well, that's right. Emerson was a great speaker.
Yeah.
But it's the kind of thing that could have happened in a classroom just as easily. The point is, it was the right time of Folger's life, the right time and the right place.
The man must have had just an incredible drive to succeed, but also what's so fascinating is that he had this drive to succeed, and how did he make so much money so fast?
Well, there were dual careers here. The drive to succeed, I think, happened in two different ways. Because he came from a relatively modest background, I think a rise in the business community was important to him, probably. A sense of self-worth or
proving himself
in that front, in that field. Yeah. And then he had this incredible passion for literature. And it was really those two areas that occupied his entire time and energy for 50 years. Yeah. He retired from Standard Oil in 1927.
At the age of 50-ish?
Yeah.
56.
He died in 1930.
Okay.
We can look up his dates, exact dates on life. I mean, he died in 1930, so he spent what would be the last 3 years of his life devoted to planning this building and working with the architect, he and Emily Jordan. Now, the building was sited in Washington, D.C. for an interesting reason, because he had looked at Stratford, he had looked at England, he had looked at other American cities. Mr. and Mrs. Folger chose Washington because they considered this collection a gift to the nation. And the property on which the library sits was known as Grant's Row. And in the 1920s, Mr. and Mrs. Folger bought up 5 townhouses on this block between 2nd and 3rd Street. The land was owned by the Library of Congress. It was ceded to them in 1923. And then they began to plan their library in earnest. Mr. Folger retired in 1927 and spent, as I said, what would be the last 3 years of his life planning this building. He died 2 weeks after the cornerstone of the building was laid, so he never saw the completed building or how the collection was housed. The room next to it...
I mean, it's almost like he sort of... Was it like he was hanging on until it was... Or is this...
No, it was sudden.
It was just a sudden thing. It wasn't... Okay.
Yeah. The room next to my office is something that we call the Founders Room. That was going to be the office space of Mr. and Mrs. Folger. We call it the Founders Room because of that intention. And it's a small, lovely room full of period furniture and paintings, and we use it for small receptions and dinners and board meetings and things like that. And as Betsy may have mentioned to you, Mr. and Mrs. Folger's ashes are behind a plaque in the reading room.
That is such a lovely touch. It's
so they're still very much with us.
Yes. And Shakespeare's bust is in between the two of them.
That's right. I mean, they have, their portraits are in the reading room, their ashes are in the reading room, and over them is a replica of the bust of the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-on-Avon.
Yeah. I wonder if the two of them, when he was dating her, I wonder if he loved Shakespeare and was sort of reading sonnets to her.
Well, it's hard to say, but what we do know is that Mrs. Folger was, they had no children. They met and married and had no children.
Which is probably why they're so happy so long.
It was a shared passion. Mrs. Folger went to Vassar. You may have noticed the portrait in the reading room. Mr. Folger's in his Amherst robe, and she's in her Vassar gown, academic gown. She did her BA and her master's thesis at Vassar, and she did her master's thesis on the first folio. So it was very much a partnership and a shared passion.
From early on in their relationship.
From early on in their relationship.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful? I mean, it's nice to have the human passion, but then obviously the depth of their relationship must have.
What we've been able to piece together about their life biographically is pretty slim, because in fact they were actually, from all outward appearances, fairly boring people. They didn't travel, they didn't entertain.
Didn't he scour the world for Shakespearean manuscripts?
Most of the time, first of all, there are no strict Shakespearean manuscripts. There are only the printed books. There's only 6 signatures extant with Shakespeare's hand, so there was no fair copy behind any of the texts. So the archive, what we know, comes down to us through printed books, and that's what they collected.
Of course, that's right. Are there examples of his handwriting or not?
6 signatures.
Just his signature?
6 signatures. Okay. And did he scour the world? No. Mr. Folger was very, in a sense, rather self-effacing. I mean, there were other collectors who had very prominent presence in the auction rooms. Mr. Folger, in fact, stayed away from the auction rooms, and most of his bidding and buying was done through agents.
But he must have had a thrill when he got them.
Of course.
There you open it up in your...
But he didn't make a display of himself as a collector.
Well, I mean, maybe that's a shrewd business move.
Well, it did. I mean, one of the things he was very much a businessman, and one of the things he was concerned about is that his presence or his name would drive up prices. Yeah. And that's the last thing that he wanted, because he was a very shrewd and a very conservative collector. He collected in that period, let's say 1880 to 1930, when it's a golden age of collecting in this country. And it's when most of the major libraries that we know today were formed. Pierpont Morgan Library.
Which has just undergone a big renovation.
Isabella Gardner in Boston. Huntington Library in San Marino, California. The Newberry Library in Chicago. These are libraries that were formed in that same period that Mr. Folger was forming his library. There were no export licenses that were required in buying from England.
So in other words, when you imported these manuscripts or books...
they weren't imported, they were just acquired.
They were just, basically you went out there, you got them, and no one cared, there were no taxes, no nothing.
You bought them and brought them home.
A bit like Napoleon did, except he didn't...
he didn't pay for them.
That's right.
So, I mean, a lot of the things that Mr. Folger collected in that period, either they couldn't be acquired today, or they would have to be acquired through the process of getting an export license.
Because of the cultural properties legislation in these countries. Yeah.
Patrimony is a greater issue today than it ever has been.
Yeah.
And fair enough. I mean, that's fine. And a lot of the things that we get today, occasionally the things that we get today through auction, have to go through review before we get an export license.
Now, what about England? Do they want to get these things like the Elgin marbles? Do they want to get them back or not?
Well, they have them now. It's Greece who wants to.
No, I'm not talking about. I'm saying the
things here.
Shakespeare stuff that you've got here.
That's a question that I ask sometimes when I'm giving tours, and joke I kind of make about it sometimes as well. When the British give back the Elgin marbles, we'll give back our 79 first folios.
But then again, you paid for them, right?
Yeah, we paid for them.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing about that is, I think, Nigel, the thing you have to remember is that it's an international community of scholars now. And it's an international research environment. The important thing is that the rare material that we have in the world today is that it's acquired legally, and that it's housed properly, and that it's made available in support of study and research. In a sense, it doesn't matter whether that collection, whether those items or objects are in London or in Paris or in Florence or in
Although the scholars in London might prefer it to be there, but still.
Well, they may prefer it to be there, but that's one of the things that, of course, technology helps us to do is locate or see items any place in the world.
Yeah, which is something we should get into.
Let me finish there.
Oh, okay, certainly.
The important thing, I think, is that collections are housed in a way that there's a corpus of material that's available to the scholarly community, and that material isn't scattered. I mean, it's much more important for, let's say, a Virginia Woolf archive or a Dickens archive or Shakespeare to be located in say 2 or 3 locations that are available to scholars rather than being dispersed too widely.
So you have a sort of a critical mass
exactly
that allows for the kind of groundbreaking scholarship that
that takes place here. And that's why it's important for us to, in our collecting profile, that's why it's important for us to focus in collection development to enhance the library's strengths and not collect out of scope just because something's available, because usually there's a better home for it.
So what is out of scope for you?
Well, let's say, for example, we wouldn't collect anything that had to do with James Joyce or William Butler Yeats.
Okay, but anything anything that's got anything to do with Shakespeare, you're going to have.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of anything to do with Shakespeare, whether it's films or whether it's broadsides or whether it's early printed books, I mean, this is the place where scholars will find it and use it.
One of the other things that I find interesting about the Folger Institute is not only do you have a fantastic, huge collection of Shakespeareana, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
I was downstairs in the vault and just looking at as far as the eye could see, just stacks and stacks of books, and that wasn't even the pre-1830 stuff.
Yeah.
That was the post-1830.
Yeah.
But in addition to all of these books and these playbills and etc. and prompt books, you also have all sorts of things to do with that period.
Exactly. Which
is just, again, it gives context.
Yeah, that's a very good point. As sort of prestigious as the Folger Shakespeare Library is, only 25% of our readers are working in Shakespeare. The collection is so strong in the early modern period that from Caxton to Dryden, let's say from 1475 to the death of Dryden in 1700, you can work across the curriculum at the research level in this library. You can work in any discipline. You can work in the history of science. You can work in early music, the Reformation, the British Civil War. There's any field. The collection is so strong that you can work in any field at the research level. And that's really,
does that mean that these people have been purchasing out of the scope then?
No. It's part of the history of the library. Mr. and Mrs. Folger collected Shakespeare, drama, Shakespeare, literature, drama, especially Shakespeare. That was their primary interest. In 1937, the library acquired the entire collection of Sir Leicester Harmsworth. Sir Leicester Harmsworth was an English collector from the publishing family. He died in 1937, and the family couldn't afford the death duties that were then imposed and put his entire collection on the market. The Folger Library sent 2 representatives to England to bid on that collection. Was
this with the approval of the wife, or is she still alive?
By Mrs. Folger, yes.
Yeah.
Sir Leicester Harmsworth collected in the same period as the Folger, the sort of STC wing period, 16th, 17th century printed books. But he collected everything but literature. He collected maps and astrology and astronomy and prints.
What a perfect marriage.
And so it's when that collection came to Washington in 1937, that's what made the Folger a powerhouse. That's what made it something besides literature and drama. And today, for English printed books to 1640, this is the largest collection outside of the British Isles. And the reason is because of the Harmsworth collection. That's what enhanced this library immeasurably and changed the collecting profile of the library for our entire history. So anything, to summarize this, I mean, any English printed book to 1700 is of interest to us because that's the core of the collection, what we call the STC and Wing period.
So basically from the Gutenberg to...
Yes, to death and Dryden, let's say through the Stuarts. Tudor-Stuart period, the Stuarts end in 1714. Roughly we say 1700 just because it's convenient. More people know John Dryden as a sort of bookend than the end of the Stuart reign. For 16th and 17th century English printed books, this is the largest collection outside the British Isles, the third largest collection in the world.
So outside the British Isles, there'd be the British Library,
Oxford, the Bodleian, and then
the
Folger.
Okay.
So it's an extraordinary collection.
Yeah.
Its core, its beginnings had to do with the passions of Mr. and Mrs. Folger, but it was the acquisition of the Harmsworth collection in 1937 that changed the profile and nature and character of this collection forever.
And made it that much more appealing for the scholars
It's really that made it, in my view, it's the acquisition of the Harmsworth collection that made the Folger a first-class research library. Yeah. So you don't just study Shakespeare, but you study Shakespeare in context.
Yes.
To what else is happening in the period, and even what's happening on the continent.
The Stephen Greenblatt book that came out recently, he focuses in on the context of Shakespeare's life, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating. I think that won a National Book Award too.
Yeah, Stephen's a brilliant man.
Did he avail himself of...
He's a welcomed reader here.
Yeah. There's another book too that's come out that's getting a bit of buzz. 1599 it's called.
I've heard of it. I haven't. It's on my list. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, apparently it obviously that was a crucial year for Shakespeare. He was so incredibly creative with Hamlet, but isn't this fascinating how this new book is getting so much buzz, and it's exactly what you're saying. It's like a cross-section of life in 1 year.
It's extraordinary. I mean, when you look at that period, let's say 1590 to 1610, Shakespeare was incredibly productive. He wrote averaged 2 plays a year. It's really quite something. Yeah. That just energy exploded in London.
I wonder what it was that...
I think in a word, genius.
It was genius, but I mean, genius not necessarily throughout the whole life. It's productive genius. Right. So I wonder what catalyst there was that just got him going nuts this way, or the visiting of the muse as using him like this.
But the plays they're by no means uniform in their brilliance. There are certainly high points and valleys, but this kind of sustained energy and that was exercised in this period. I mean, it's pretty astonishing. That's the miracle that's the blessing of the first folio. This published in 1623. Without the first folio, there may be half of those plays which we wouldn't have today. I think it was 17 or 18 of the plays appeared for the first time in the first folio. A book assembled by 2 of his fellow actors, John Hemming and Henry Condell. Dedicatory poem to the reader by Ben Jonson. It's a wonderful tribute to a colleague, a writer, a man of the theater, who had little ambition of having his works published in his lifetime.
Yeah, it's a bit like Kafka, isn't it? I mean, maybe he wasn't quite as morose, or Shakespeare probably didn't say, burn them all.
Yeah, I mean,
but
he instructed Kafka instructed Max Brod to burn his manuscript.
Exactly.
And mercifully, he didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like Sidney's Arcadia was written for the amusement of his sister, the Countess of Pembroke, and he gave her pages at a time and instructed her to destroy them after she read them. Luckily, she disobeyed her brother, didn't listen to him, kept the manuscript, and the rest is history. We have the Arcadia, which has gone through multiple editions. In fact, the Countess of Pembroke edited one of the editions in 1593. So the way texts come down to us is ever fascinating to me.
Yes, well, again, and of course the printers taking liberties with the text, just suppose trying to package something up that'll sell better,
that's exactly
what?
Right. That's exactly right. And that the printing history of Shakespeare's plays, whether in quarto or folio, is really quite interesting. And the fact that there's no manuscript, there's no fair copy behind the text, behind the plays, makes the printed copies so very important. And the ones that were produced in his lifetime, and of course the folio which was produced after his death. And
why is that? Why aren't there any manuscripts? Is it because he ripped them off so quickly, and then they weren't put in a sort of a. It's not like a novel. It was more like a working document, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that when Shakespeare was writing, he made his money as a man of the theater, not a published author. He made his money by filling seats and selling tickets and packing the theater day after day after day. The copyright didn't happen until 1709. There wasn't a lot of incentive to be a published writer. And the idea of producing a text and having it sold also made it easier for a rival company to take your Richard III, perform it, steal your audience, and that hurts you and that hurts the pocketbook of the Kingsmen. So on one hand, we marvel that there are no manuscripts that are left, but on the other,
just an astute business move.
It may have been that.
And just to follow in on that, to see the parallel between Folger and Shakespeare, both as brilliant businessmen.
That's interesting. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. Except Mr. Folger wasn't an artist. He
wasn't an artist, but he appreciated the art of this wonderful businessman.
It could be. I find the period interesting. I mean, it's not called the Renaissance for nothing. I mean, there's so much that's happening in business and literature, and politics and exploration, and that period, the Tudor Stuart period. The Tudors it's a fascinating period in English history. There's so much going on, and of course, England's great queen is at the center of it.
And this is why, as I read plays, this is why there are so many powerful female characters in Shakespeare, because of Elizabeth.
It could be. I mean, there's certainly some extraordinary heroines in the play.
His brilliance, too, I think, was a function of trying to escape the authorities shutting him down. He wanted to get these not necessarily seditious messages out, but messages that maybe they weren't approved by the authorities.
That's right.
But what a clever, brilliant way of getting the messages out. And in fact, an authoritarian regime may inspire great work of art.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he was he dared to put the Queen's. The late Queen's father on the stage in Henry VIII. I mean, that was a fairly bold move.
Didn't lose his head.
No, that's right.
We talk about that period being such an amazing period for exploration in all sorts of different areas. Now, our time is quite an amazing time in terms of transforming how we're living our lives through the internet, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you're making what you have here available to a wider audience, and if that's part of your mandate.
Sure. Let's look back in time a little bit, and the beginning of printing. That's in Europe. In a sense, printing was a killer technology. I mean, it came at a time. And it usurped the role of a kind of manuscript tradition. But I think the point is that we find increasingly is that the two forms of expression, manuscripts and print, existed simultaneously for a good while. We have a situation today where we have a new technology, we have the internet, we have digitization, in the time of print and of print culture, a modern print culture. The issues, I think, are not dissimilar. That I don't look upon the internet or the technology as something which is going to entirely usurp print in our culture, but rather something that will exist simultaneously, in parallel with print. And I think this is the role that I like to see the Folger, where mentally I kind of see the Folger occupying. We are fundamentally an environment of print because of the great treasures that we have here in the library. But we also have a responsibility to disseminate that information, those texts, those images, through the available technology. And one of the interesting things I think about the technology is that it's a preservation tool. An electronic surrogate can help reduce handling in some cases. But ironically, it's also a way of extending access and getting that item, quote-unquote, handled more by experienced and inexperienced users, people all up and down the educational ladder.
Well, the other thing, too, is like, what's the big deal about you come here, there are the folios, you see the original, you kind of, oh, nice paper, oh, look at the nice ink. Mm-hmm. But really, I mean, it's the content.
Yeah, it's the content.
It's wonderful to see the original.
Yeah.
It's breathtaking.
Yeah.
But in terms of scholarship, whoop-de-doo.
Well, I would take issue with that a little bit, because there's a good many scholars in the world. Their work so much involves the study of a physical object. We have people working with books not in ways that, in a sense, have nothing to do with content. Yeah. We have people working with bindings and with illustrations and with...
But what do you mean working, though? Working, they come in and they are admiring and trying to replicate... Is that what you mean?
No. We have people, bibliographers, textual scholars. We have people who are very much involved in the history of the book, who are coming and looking at the book as an artifact.
As much looking at the bindings, then, and
exactly, much the same way you might look at a vase or a painting. Mm. And there's a point at which that a substitute is no substitute. You need to see the real. No. You need to see the real thing.
But I guess my question, though,
so we appeal to both worlds, in a sense.
Yeah.
Those who are looking at the collection for its content, and those who are studying the collection aspects of it as physical objects.
But my question, though, is it seems to me that the vast majority of people that would come here are interested in the content.
I think that's true. I think that's fair, Nigel.
Which means then that and of course this brings up one of the most, the current word and company, the great American company, Google.
Sure.
What's happening with Google here?
Google hasn't approached us yet in terms of a massive digitization project, but in a sense that we're already out there doing something similar.
I mean, you're going through scanning everything?
We're not going through scanning everything, but what we're doing is we have a Department of Photography and Digital Imaging, and one of the projects, for example, that's starting this month is to digitize our collection of pre-1640 Shakespeare quartos. Full text, every page, every binding, to make this archive available electronically for study and research.
Sorry, you lost me with the binding. What did you say you were doing again?
We're scanning the entire text. We're scanning the text, and which includes images of the preliminary pages and even the bindings, which will become part of the digital archive.
So you're actually scanning the binding.
Cover to cover. We're taking digital photographs of
okay.
We're taking digital photographs of the entire object cover to cover. Mm. Now, we've done this with a first folio. We've done this with some other items. We have an archive of about 7,000 digital images that we're making available.
Which means what? They're up on the web for anyone to have a look at?
That's right, searchable, and a user could find an image and order that image through our photography department and they could be in Des Moines, Iowa, and have that image just delivered to them electronically. We have another project that I'm very interested in. It's called Picturing Shakespeare. We want to create an archive, an electronic archive of 10,000 images, works of art on paper that have to do with Shakespeare and the times and Shakespeare and the plays, Shakespeare and his plays. So, for example, if a school child wanted to know what does the word Malvolio appears cross-gartered in Twelfth Night, what does cross-gartered mean? Well, the easiest way to show that is through an image of a character dressed in cross-gartered. And you could search cross-gartered, or you could search Malvolio and through the Folger database and come up with a series of images that you could use in a secondary education in a classroom. A scholar might want a particular image of a 19th century actor or actress for a cover of a book. These are the ways to get...
It's almost like a fashion statement. You're able to see throughout the decades.
Well, exactly right. I mean, it's
what is cross-garter anyway?
He appears yellowed...
That's funny because I saw it in London.
Right.
I was going to say it was yellow and black.
Exactly.
It was the funniest. Cross-gartered means yellow?
His legs are wrapped in a certain way where the garter is sort of entwined around his legs, and perfectly ridiculous, of course. And every time Malvolio comes on the stage, hoots of laughter are there.
But does it have to be yellow?
Well, it appears in the plays as yellow, so that's the way that it's staged.
So, in other words, that would have...
That's an example of how an image database can be helpful to users.
But let's just fix on the yellow.
Okay.
So, one of the first folios, or the prompt books, i.e., the books that maybe the stage director they sort of put little notes, stage notes and whatever. One of the very first ones dressed in yellow.
Well, it's if I'm not mistaken, it comes from Shakespeare, not from a later.
Oh, it's in the content.
Yeah, it's in the content.
Oh, it's just okay.
Yeah. But I think the point, I mean, to sort of answer your question, I think the Folger has a responsibility to preserve and enhance a legacy that has come down to us in printed books and art and objects. We also have a responsibility to disseminate information about that collection and indeed the collection itself through existing technology. And we're committed to both. It's not one or the other. Just as in the 16th century, manuscripts and printed books existed simultaneously. I think now our efforts are to both maintain and provide access to the physical collection as well as provide access to the collection electronically. Because you reach more users, and it's a way of sharing this great collection with a larger audience.
Mm-hmm. Well, and bringing just magnificent the culture, expanding it, and
well, that's right. That's right. I don't think there's anything that replaces, let's say, a museum goer's experience. Mm. My wife and I were in Paris, and we went to the Musée d'Orsay, and standing in front of Van Gogh's Sunflowers, I realized I'd never seen a yellow like that in my life.
Yeah. Even if they've replicated it and you can see it in a book or on the computer,
it's never.
It's not.
It's not. It's something. Yeah. It's something different. It's something else. You know, there are books in this collection that I hold, and I break out and I get chills holding this book, these treasures, and I have yet to get a chill looking at something on a monitor. Yeah. There's something about the physical object that speaks to us, that still speaks to us in interesting ways and instructive ways. And that's something that's not, in my view, is not going to go away, as long as people are passionate about their lives and curious about history.
It's beautifully put. The other thing that's impressive about the facility here, speaking of the text, when you think of Shakespeare, you think of the text. Most people do, but you have a fantastic collection of, as you've said before, a lot of the what are these things? The billboards and playbills.
That's
right. That offer a lovely graphic companion to the text.
Exactly. I think one of the things that's interesting is to sort of study the world of the theater around the text. David Garrick, the great 18th century actor-manager, was at Drury Lane for decades and changed the nature of theater irrevocably. And one of the things that's interesting is to look at those playbills from the time of mid-18th century, the time that Garrick was at Drury Lane, and to look closely at those playbills and see how theater was changing. And it has nothing to do with what was being performed on the stage, but we have lines in the playbills, for example, that no tickets will be sold half price. Because, of course, what happened at Drury Lane is that your audience would go out and get drunk, have dinner and get drunk, and come in for the last act of the play and disrupt the proceedings. And so, with half price tickets, exactly. Well, this was after the groundlings. Much after that. This is 18th century. There's also lines prohibiting the audience from going backstage, because one of the things that Garrick did is he gave the actors a degree of privacy. He created an environment where actors were treated as artists and as professionals, and
as opposed to
actresses were actresses and not mistresses, and kept the audience in their seats, darkened the house lights to throw attention onto the stage rather than on the preening audience members. So there's lots of things about these objects that tell us about a sort of a cultural snapshot of the period and how plays were performed, regardless of what plays Garrick chose to put on the stage. And that's fascinating to us because, you know, we learn a lot about ourselves and our own theater experience today by seeing the changes that went through production and production styles.
But we could be, we're being taken away, perhaps, from what Shakespeare's original intent might have been. I mean, his intent, given the environment, his play may have been in part designed to stir up the kind of reaction in an audience that we just don't see now.
Well, it's hard to say,
But by that I mean vocal, heckling and this type of thing that just doesn't happen in the theater now.
No, that's right. I mean, there's a different etiquette. There's different etiquette in the theater now than certainly was in the Elizabethan period. And I think some of the films that have come out are very good in capturing that. Shakespeare in Love was one of them. However inaccurate it may be historically, or how much conjecture is behind the film, it gives a wonderful feel from the period. I think the thing that we need to remember is that when Shakespeare was performing his plays on the South Bank, it wasn't art; it was entertainment. It was
an afternoon out. It was
the bear baiting garden was just down a short ways away. In times of civil unrest, these were the first places to be the theaters were the first places to be shut down. The theaters weren't sort of meccas of culture. They were surrounded by prisons, pickpockets, and prostitutes. And it was a Saturday afternoon entertainment. The flag went up, and the crowd came in. And you make them laugh, and you entertain them, and you make them happy. You take their penny, or you take their price of admission, and then they go home. And then you count your proceeds after the audience leaves, and then you do it again the next day.
It's kind of ironic too, though, isn't it? It's ironic because back then, perhaps the cultured in society would have looked down on it, whereas now,
that's right.
It's completely the opposite.
It's just the opposite. I mean, in a sense, in many ages, art has been suspect. It's been a little bit fringe. It's been a little bit scurrilous. It's been a little bit irreverent. And in a sense drawn the wrath of governments and of the church and of society and of the gentry. And that's the wonderful thing about art, is that its appeal, its utter honesty, its refusal to placate, its brashness, its rashness, its irreverence, and its utter beauty and honesty. And that's what theater is about.
Well, and it's also this boldness,
exactly,
in the face of.
That's right.
Shakespeare could have been. Well, I don't know if he could have been beheaded, but he could have been thrown in jail for sure.
He certainly could have been. It was a risky time to be involved in the theater. I mean, the theaters could be shut down at any particular time. You could have gotten in trouble with a stationer's company. You could get in trouble with a patron. There's lots of things that could have gone wrong that would have kept you from performing, or created fines or some other kind of punishment that you would have undergone.
Well, and thrown into abject poverty, which is
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And you realize. I mean, and again, I think it's true today. I mean, the risks that theaters take, the risks that artists take. That's something that seems to be embedded in human nature. That's not going to go away. And I love seeing the recklessness today, because it reminds me of the recklessness that we've had through the centuries, which is the price to create great art.
Just in closing, is one of your mandates to foster and instill a love of the bard in a larger audience, or not?
Instilling love, that's a good question. We would hope so. I think our job as a research library and as a cultural institution is to open doors. Education, someone once said, education is the sound of a door opening. And our job is to open doors and create opportunities and access in a variety of ways, through exhibitions, through performances.
But what would Folger himself have thought? What would he? I mean, obviously, this is what you spend your time thinking about. What would he want? Does he want more people to love Shakespeare in the way that he loved Shakespeare because it added so much to his life?
I think unquestionably the answer to that is yes. And
I mean, that's why he got all this stuff together in the first place,
and why he established a library to create access in perpetuity. And I think the other thing that's interesting about that is that look at the footprint of this building. At the east end is a theater, and on the north side of the building is an exhibition hall, and then the library proper is a research library. So you have both a public space and a private space. It's a center for the performing arts as well as a center for advanced research. And Mr. Folger, I mean, had that in mind from the very beginning. It's not like we tacked on a theater later. The space was there in 1932.
Which is, he is the one that designed it, so you're not...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's an extraordinary vision, I think, and it's a vision that is founded in a love of the art and the objects, a love of the literature, but also a passion for sharing that with other people. And I think Mr. Folger would love the fact that we have 4 productions a year in the theater. I think he would love the fact that we do a student Shakespeare festival that draws students from 57 schools to perform scenes from the plays on our stage. I think he would love the fact that some of the most eminent poets and writers in this country are reading on the stage of the Folger Shakespeare Library. I think he would love the fact that the exhibitions are free and open to the public, and anyone can wander in and spend whatever time they want looking at some of the treasures of this collection.
Isn't it great to be able to this great man to participate in his dream?
Well, it is. I mentioned in the beginning, we were talking when you were setting up, and I said, little boys don't grow up wanting to be librarians. Something happens along the way, some mentoring, some exposure, some encounter that makes you look at this world, the world of libraries, in a different way. And for myself, what I saw was a world that was peopled by individuals of real integrity. We don't open the door in the morning because we want to make money off of anybody. We open in the door in the morning because we're trying to advance and support study and research. And something...
With joy, too, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
But my experience with Shakespeare, they are some of the pinnacle, the best times I've ever had in my life have been sitting down with a good friend over a beer, talking about the play that we've just read.
That's exactly right. And that kind of experience, I think, is timeless. People have been sitting down like that with a beverage and talking about art and talking about plays and performance and what they've just read for centuries. And it's one of the great luxuries in life, to sit down and pause and to talk with a friend about what you've just read or what you've just seen, and compare mental notes and describe how it's impressed you, what you liked, what you didn't like, how you've been impressed, what it has meant in your life. That's one of the great joys, I think, of waking up in the morning and going through the day, is that opportunity to reflect and converse and be with a friend and talk about the things that have moved you. And that's what art does for us. It gives us a platform. It gives us an opportunity for that kind of exposure.
Well, thank you very much for being a custodian of such an impressive platform. Thank you for your time.
People sometimes ask me what it's like to be at the Folger, and I've been here for 12 years now, and I think whether it's my first year or now, it's a privilege to be here.
Richard de Kostka is the Eric Weinman librarian at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Nigel.